As we talked about earlier, the correct answer to a sufficient assumption question will be the answer that, if added to the argument in the stimulus, will guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So take this argument. My neighbor's pet is a pit bull, therefore my neighbor's pet is cuddly. What could we add that would be sufficient to guarantee the conclusion of this argument? Of course, a really great answer would be, if it's a pit bull, then it's cuddly. If we add that to the argument, it would prove that my neighbor's pet is cuddly since it's a pit bull. But what if we learned that all dogs are cuddly, or all animals are cuddly, or everything my neighbor owns is cuddly? These statements would all be sufficient assumptions because if you added any one of them to the argument, the conclusion would have to follow. It's also good to notice that these are much broader than the argument really needs, but that's totally fine. It's okay for the right answer to a sufficient assumption to be overkill. As long as the statement guarantees the conclusion of the argument, we're good. It's still a sufficient assumption. Now that we know what a sufficient assumption is, let's get into the method for identifying them. So the first step should sound pretty familiar. Read the stimulus and distinguish the conclusion from the premises. This step is really important to get right because if you don't find the right conclusion, you're going to be trying to find an answer that guarantees the wrong thing, and that will not end well for you. Step number 2 is to identify why the premises don't prove the conclusion. So in other words, what's the gap in the argument? So for whatever reason, in so many sufficient assumption questions, the argument brings up a new concept in the conclusion, and the premises just don't tell us anything about it. And for the second step, where we try to identify the gap in the argument, you can kind of think of it as, is there a concept brought up in the conclusion that doesn't show up in the premises? If there is, then you want to bridge the gap between the premise and the conclusion. So we have Teresa, and she started a company that sells denim wedding dresses, because fashion. Therefore, she will own a plane and a yacht. Obviously, that's an invalid argument, but let's think about the missing piece. So a lot of people who don't know the LSAT as well as you do would think something like, oh, well, we want to know that the company is going to sell a lot of the dresses, or that, Teresa's going to get really rich from her company. But no, and also no. These statements don't prove with 100% logical certainty that she's going to own a plane and a yacht. Do they make it more likely that she's going to get her plane and yacht? Yeah, totally. But do they guarantee it? No. Owning a plane and yacht is a new concept that the premise didn't tell us anything about. So to bridge the gap, we want a statement that says something like, anyone who starts a company that sells denim wedding dresses will soon own a plane and a yacht. That would totally make the argument valid. I know, it's weird because it sort of feels like it's cheating, like it's too good to be true or something. But the truth is, a sufficient assumption is often just something that says, if the premise is true, then the conclusion is true. This way to bridge the gap comes up so often in sufficient assumption questions that you should get into the habit of explicitly asking whether there are new concepts brought up in the conclusion that weren't mentioned in the premises. If there are, then the correct answer should be a connection between the premises and the new concept.